Well, hello. It's Tuesday, August 10th. Unless it isn't. I have no idea when you listen to this show. It's a podcast, too. I can't be responsible for that. I have so many other things to worry about. So I'm sorry I haven't brought up the date at all. A little bit later on the show, you're going to be reminded about, unless you are too young to benefit from being reminded about, the 20th anniversary of the birth of the Segway. But also, I don't know. I've already recorded this particular segment. It's kind of interestingly forward-looking, too. Like, if we'd taken the Segway a little bit more seriously, maybe our climate problem would be a little bit less horrible than it is right now. And we'll also talk in the final segment about a project that kind of mirrors some of the early intent of the Segway. It's actually a project to study squirrel decision-making and squirrel motility, with the goal of developing incredibly flexible robots and maybe devices that will help people with specific kinds of disabilities related to grasping and motility. But we're going to begin with this story. I never thought I would feel sorry for an insensate astral body, but I kind of do about this. I'll explain it to you in just a second, or it'll become clear in just a second. I don't know what you were doing on November 3rd of 2018. Ariana Grande had released a Thank You Next, and everything else that happened on that day was some horrific Trump administration thing that we all just need to forget about as soon as possible. Except for one man who was staying up late playing a video game called Counter-Strike. And he was also keeping track of another thing. And that's where we're going to begin our story today. We're going to talk to Jonathan O'Callaghan, a freelance space and science journalist. He is not the man staying up late playing the video game, but he knows about him. And he joins us now to tell us the story of what is known as the accident. So first of all, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So let's begin. Let's begin with this gentleman who's staying up late playing a video game, but he's also keeping track of a kind of space surveillance. He's looking for something. He's searching for something. What does he find?
Yeah, he finds this kind of fast-moving object about 50 light years away from us that is kind of very cold, very faint, and that we think is a class of object called a brown dwarf, which is kind of a failed star, something that kind of grew quite big but never got big enough to begin nuclear fusion in its core. So it's kind of in this murky borderland between a planet and a fully fledged star.
Yes, I mean, this is sort of one of many interesting parts about this thing is that, I think when we are in grade school and perhaps beyond that, our teachers basically tell us there's a pretty solid taxonomy, right? Stars are stars, planets are planets, asteroids are asteroids, etc. But actually there are these kinds of things that are neither exactly 100% fish nor fowl. And this kind of falls into that category. Maybe you can say a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So, we actually know of a few thousand of these objects in our galaxy. They're quite plentiful, and as kind of dust and gas comes together in the universe, it can form planets. It can form stars that have planets around them. But if you don't have quite enough mass, things never get quite big enough to reach the kind of hot temperatures you need in the core of that object to begin nuclear fusion. We think that temperature is around 3 million degrees Celsius. So pretty hot. But, if you don't quite reach that temperature, you never begin this process of burning hydrogen and helium and producing new elements. So you just kind of become like a very big Jupiter sort of thing. So brown dwarfs occupy this mass range that's roughly about 13 times the mass of Jupiter, up to about 75 times the mass of Jupiter. They're kind of in this broad range between planets and stars. But at either end of those scales, the two sides of the boundary are pretty murky, especially that upper scale. We don't really know when nuclear fusion begins. We don't really know why something that's 75 times the mass of Jupiter would be a star or a brown dwarf. And we're just kind of trying to get to the bottom of that at the moment.
Right. So, I mean, it's for me kind of counterintuitive to think of something that was, first of all, there's so much judgmental language around this thing. Failed star. I mean, and then they call it the accident just because of the way it was discovered. But this thing, the accident, is a placeholder for, as you say, many other astral bodies kind of in this gray area. Although a thing that was supposed to be a star, in my mind, isn't going to, for example, have an atmosphere. But some of these things do have atmospheres, correct?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say all of them have atmospheres. We don't quite know what it would look like to be up close to one of these objects, but it would probably look a little bit like Jupiter. You'd see some banding, kind of the result of high winds in the atmosphere. We have measured the winds on a brown dwarf before. You'd probably see some spot-like storms, like Jupiter's Great Red Spot. And they probably would look kind of red or orange, not brown. The name brown dwarf is a bit of a misnomer. That was coined because we already had brown dwarfs and we already had yellow dwarfs. The next one down was brown dwarf. So it's not a quite true reflection of what they look like. But yeah, these things have clouds, they have atmospheres, they probably have storms, they have high winds. So if you didn't know otherwise, you'd probably say it looked like a lot like a big planet.
Right. So, there is, as you say, a spectrum, a continuum of these things. The accident, the body that we're talking about that was discovered more or less by accident, is on one end of this scale, right? It's an extremely small, cold, and faint object, as you write. Say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. So all of the brown dwarfs we found so far, they generally follow quite a similar trend. So throughout the history of the universe, heavy elements, which we call metals, those are produced when stars explode as supernovae. And if something is rich in metals, it means it's probably a newer object. For example, our sun is relatively rich in metals, so it must have formed quite recently in the universe, in universe terms, last 5 billion years or so. But this object, which is very close to us, so in our young region of the galaxy, is really metal poor. It doesn't really have many metals at all, which means it must have formed a long time ago, maybe one of the first brown dwarfs to form in our galaxy, which is confusing because it shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be next to us. It should be somewhere else in the galaxy. It should be towards the edge of the galaxy where a lot of older stars are. It shouldn't be near us. So this is why this object is interesting, because it kind of doesn't fit any of the class we have so far for brown dwarfs. If you look at it on a graph, it kind of is an outlier to all other known brown dwarfs. So that's led a few different theories to what it might be. The leading theory at the moment is a really old brown dwarf that came from kind of the outer galaxy and was pushed inwards towards us, is now zooming past. But it could be something more exotic. It could even be a planet itself, a really big planet that was ejected from a star. Or it could be the remnant of another star. It could be like an old core of a star or a white dwarf. But at the moment, we think it was probably a brown dwarf that was kind of kicked inwards from the outer galaxy towards us.
Right. And you say zooming, it's not supposed to be here, but it's here. But it's definitely moving, right? I mean, that would be one of the explanations as to how it got here.
Yeah, it's moving at, I think, 200 kilometers per second, if I'm remember that correctly. Yeah, that's right. Which is, that's pretty quick. I mean, obviously things are, that's relative to us. That's pretty quick. But, we're all moving at hundreds of kilometers per second in orbit and then around the galaxy. So yeah, it's quick relative to everything else, but things in space are all relatively fast compared to something else. So
it's kind of interesting because we saw, in my lifetime and yours probably, the downgrading of Pluto from a planet. This is a thing that's kind of coming at it's not a planet, but these brown dwarfs, or whatever it is we're going to call them, they're kind of planet curious, right? They have atmospheres. Some of them have protoplanetary disks. I'll have you explain what that is in a second. And that raises questions also about what else might conceivably be orbiting them. But first of all, explain the protoplanetary disks.
Sure. So when a star forms, a star forms from dust and gas collapsing under gravity and forming like a hot protostar. And then that will have its own gravitational field, which will have like a disk of dust and gas swirling around it, which is called a protoplanetary disk. And that is where you get planets form, like Earth and all planets of our solar system. They gradually coalesce from that disk around a star. So that's the strict definition between stars and planets. Planets don't have a disk that forms planets around them, although they can form moons. But a star will have its own disk and forms planets. But we do think that there are some brown dwarfs that can also form planets in the same way that a star can do, which is kind of confusing because they're quite big, but not that big. And if they can have planets, then what is a planet and what is a star and what can host what? then things get kind of muddled when you get down to like the nitty gritty of it.
Yes, no, you're making my head hurt. I mean, everything was so orderly before I started talking to you. So just to back up and make sure people kind of grasp that. So here's this thing. It was supposed to be a star. It didn't have ultimately the energy components that was required to become a star. We're not even 100% sure how that whole process works or doesn't work. So it's not a planet, unless it is. And it's a failed star, but it might have something like it. Not probably this one, the accident, but some of them might actually have something that's either a moon or a planet going around and around it, right?
Yeah, some of these things, could have planets going around them. I mean, that raises interesting kind of speculation because obviously you need a certain amount of energy on a planet to produce anything notable, like any life or vegetation. So you could imagine any planet orbiting a brown dwarf is probably not the most exciting place in the world, probably just some hunk of rock with little few features on it, kind of Mercury-esque. But yeah, I guess you kind of have these things which are failed stars, and maybe they can have kind of failed solar systems orbiting them as well, which is maybe a bit depressing.
Is it always going to be called the accident? Is there some kind of plan to maybe rebrand it somehow?
Well, it's got a scientific name, which is WISE 1534-1043. Actually, it's much longer than that, but that's the shortened version of it. But no, we don't tend to give these things proper names. There are thousands of brown dwarfs, and there are billions upon billions of stars and billions upon billions of planets. If we start naming everything, we're going to be there a long time. So only the very interesting things tend to get kind of quirky names that are unofficial.
All right. Well, this is definitely an interesting thing. It's near us. It's not supposed to be near us. It barely knows what it is, and neither do we. So thanks very much for your time today. Jonathan O'Callaghan is a freelance space and science journalist. He wrote about this, I believe, initially for Quanta. Thanks for doing this with us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
All right. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to remind you about the saga of the Segway, but not entirely in a mocking way, I promise. So this is kind of weird because I suppose I should insist that we planned it this way, but that's actually not true. The segment that's going to follow this one is going to be about a squirrel psychologist who's part of a team studying squirrels with the goal of developing devices that can use squirrel motility and decision-making to improve the motility and grasping ability of people with certain kinds of disabilities, physical disabilities, and also to develop the most agile robot ever, which is kind of weird because what we're going to talk about now started 20 years ago and involved an inventor who was interested in sort of similar questions. How do you develop a machine one kind of machine that can help people with certain physical disabilities and another kind of machine that kind of mimics and enhances natural movements. I'm talking, of course, about Dean Kamen, perhaps not, of course, inventor of the Segway and of a very specific kind of wheelchair. And I'm talking about the big surprise that was known as IT, or known as Ginger, depending on who you were talking to back in those days. 20 years ago, we got the Segway. And here to talk to us about this are Steve Kemper, the author of several books, including Reinventing the Wheel, the story of genius, innovation, and grand ambition. Dan Kois is an editor and writer at Slate, although his role in this is in a different job in a different time. And we're going to begin by explaining. Well, Steve, you should begin by explaining. You wrote the book, as they say. You were working on a book. You had Dan as an agent. Tell us about that book.
Well, first, it's all Dan's fault that all this has been written.
Yes. There's sort of a big festival of blaming Dan for everything right now, and Dan is participating in a very self-lacerating way. So, but yeah,
it's been quite a week.
So, Steve, go ahead. You were approached by Dean Kamen, this inventor, to do a book.
Right. I'd done a profile of him for Smithsonian Magazine, and I don't know, maybe a couple of years later, he called me up to his research and development place and said he had done something that was the best thing ever. And this is a guy who invented the drug transfusion pump and all kinds of things that were major inventions that had helped the world. And he said, and the thing I'm about to start working on is going to change the world, and I'd like it to be written about in a book. And so that's how it started. He wanted to pay me to do it. And I said, no, I'm a journalist. And so I'll do it if you just let me hang around and don't have any control over the final product. And I'll take my chances that I can interest someone. And that's how Dan got involved.
Right. And by the way, for the long form and very good audio version of this story, I can't recommend enough the episode of Decoder Ring, which is a terrific podcast anyway, but the episode that deals with this. You get a much longer and more detailed version of the story that we're about to tell you. But, Dan, just to telescope the story a little bit, one of the things I think that one of the conclusions you have come to is that the entire narrative that we're about to explore here would have been different, and probably different in a better way, if in fact this hadn't been initially introduced to the public as something, nobody knew what, that was going to, quote, change the world, unquote.
Yeah, so we're talking about 1999, 2000 here, when Steve approached me and I was a baby agent at a literary agency outside Washington, D.C., just starting to try and get my own clients. I'd been an assistant for a couple of years. And Steve was one of the first journalists I spoke to who just had like a really amazing idea. And the only problem was that the amazing idea was totally secret. He couldn't even tell us what this invention was that he was writing about, that this genius inventor had been working on and said would change the world. And people like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos agreed that it would change the world. And so when we sold that book proposal at the very beginning of 2001, we sold it to a publisher, Harvard Business School Press, without them knowing what the invention was. They took a flyer on it, thanks to Steve's extremely good proposal and the testimonials of these people who were involved in it, and the bona fides of Dean Kamen, who had invented these incredible things. And just a few days after we made that deal, the news leaked. The book proposal was got leaked to journalists, and a website called inside.com wrote about it. And the fact that you couldn't know what the invention was, above all else, was what drove people crazy and what created this incredible, what I think of as one of the first truly viral moments of the new internet in 2001, where not only was everyone on the internet talking about it, everyone was talking about it on CNN, on NPR, on the BBC, on Good Morning America, the New York Times. It was everywhere, and it was because of the secrecy. And so, as Steve wrote so well in his book, and as I tried to show in the Decoder Ring podcast in my piece in Slate, the way that everyone could create these fanciful visions of what this thing could be, a hoverboard or a jetpack or matter transference or God knows what, that got everyone's expectations so high that basically anything that Dean Kamen presented short of, a tube to Mars would have been a disappointment.
But the other part of this, there's so many other parts of this. So I went back and reread some of Steve's book, and I was emailing him this morning. I should say, I know Steve. I knew Steve 20 years ago. I was hanging around with him at parties when he couldn't tell us what his book was about. I think you might have even been on my old WTIC show, not being able to tell us what the book was going to be about. But it's really, I don't know. I was emailing Steve this morning. I said, really, this book is really ripened in a really interesting way. It's like like, I mean, this. We should talk about the. I think it's called the West Coast Ambush in the book. There's this scene where Kamen is basically invited out to the West Coast to show his thing to really the Brahmins of the tech revolution. Particularly, Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos are in this scene. And Steve, maybe you just should say a little bit about it. There's a way in which that moment predicts both some of the folly that would follow, but also shows just some of the appeal of this to very smart people who are accustomed to making very good business decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. These guys, they all assembled in this ballroom at this hotel, and the doors were locked, and came in with a couple of duffel bags that were clanking, and he opened them up and proceeded to assemble this little machine. And then they started riding around this ballroom whooping, especially Bezos, who's notorious for his big honking laugh. And then Jobs came in and just basically crapped on everything about it, and he was trying to convince Dean. He had a two-pronged strategy, I think. He wanted to convince Dean that he should be the mastermind behind it, not the doofuses in New Hampshire, and that he should that Dean should let him be the major investor and shove aside all these minor players like Bezos and John Doerr. So it was a clash of monumental egos, brains, enthusiasm. And you have to remember throughout all this, Dean is the most amazing salesman that I've ever seen in my life. He can sell, he did sell everybody this idea that it was going to be bigger than the internet, bigger than the car. It was going to do everything. They all believed it, and they're all smarter than I am. So I thought, well, if they believe it, it must be true. And so that's the chapter that I used to send to Dan, that he sent out without telling anybody what happened, what the machine was, what they did on the machine, nothing like that.
You know,
so I knew it was going to be one of the centerpieces of the book, and it was.
There's another moment in that chapter I want to just bring up, Dan, which is, so there's a moment where somebody else who's not a well-known person at that point, but goes on to be pretty well-known, Eileen Lee, who's working at that point for John Doerr. Eileen Lee, among other people, is apparently, or at least credited with being the person who coined the term unicorn in its kind of tech sector startup business usage, which is kind of funny also in this context. But she uses what's sort of MBA jargon, as Steve writes at the time, value proposition. She asks one of Kamen's people, what's the value proposition here? And she lists other kinds of devices and explains what it means sort of in this context. What's the primary selling point? You're going to want this thing because why? You're going to want this thing for what? And the Kamen's guy can't really answer the question. And to me, Dan, rereading that section today, I thought, oh, the doom of the Segway is kind of writ large in that conversation. I don't know whether you react the same way.
I did. And, in hearing Steve retell the story just now, I started just trying to figure out what was it that those geniuses were responding to in that room. And it clearly wasn't a clear and obvious value proposition, even though Dean had high hopes for the specific problems that this invention would solve, the so-called last mile problem, where how do you get around a crowded city in a way that isn't a car, but that gets you from your subway stop to your office, for example, or from your apartment to the store. His company wasn't truly in the process of making something at a price point and a size that could solve that problem right away. And so it seems like what, from the storytelling in Steve's book, what everyone in that room was responding to was the thing that everyone who ever stepped on a Ginger, a Segway, responded to instantly, which was just how magical it felt, like riding a magic carpet. I always think of it as like surfing. How are you being propelled forward, in this totally beautiful way? It makes you more elegant than you ever have been in real life. And so the idea of these guys becoming instantly convinced, as I think Steve Jobs says in that chapter, the problem won't be convincing people to buy it. The problem will be having enough of them to make sure that everyone gets one. No one's going to need convincing, everyone thought. The very act of setting foot on one is enough to convince you forever that this is the future.
You know, Steve, it's weird having this conversation with you and Dan on this particular day because we're, kind of one day out from this really horrifying but not surprising climate report. And is there some part of you that when you read news like that, you think we should have been gingering, more people should have been gingering for the last 20 years, and the news would still be bad, but not as bad? I mean, there's a way in which the vision that came in had some real truth at the heart of it.
Yeah, I'm totally convinced that you're right about that. The idea is beautiful. The machine is beautiful. And everything else that Dean did was wrong. In fact, he sabotaged his own ideas in so many ways. And it would be better. You're absolutely right. If we had small segways that were safe on the sidewalks and people were using them. I mean, look at the stuff that's in the cities now. It's craziness, these scooters that people use, motorized bikes, and who knows how many people go to the hospital because of these poorly engineered yet very serviceable, because they're needed, ways to get from point A to point B shortly in a short amount of time. Dean's idea, as Dan said in the podcast, the problem is it was too good, it was too elegant, and we just needed some mediocre way to do it. I wish more people had realized it at the time.
Right. The Segway wasn't the answer to the question. The Segway was the first step. And one thing that the sort of very public, nearly comical failure of the Segway did is that it slowed people down, I think, from really trying to address that market for, a good 10 years. And so the things that, as Steve notes, you see zipping around cities now, which I'm inclined to believe are usually basically safe enough in the grand scheme of things, took longer to get to cities. And so we're even further behind the 8 ball than we are. And the big changes that we've seen in cities like New York and Paris, and even smaller cities over the last year, even during the pandemic, as they've started to shut down streets and make their central cores less accessible to cars and more accessible to pedestrians and people on these little devices, is the kind of change that if Dean hadn't totally screwed up the Segway, with some assistance perhaps from me, we might have seen happen 20 years ago.
I think you need to let yourself off the hook there. But yes, it is my pleasure to tell you that the kinds of products that you're talking about now are referred to by the Consumer Product Safety Commission as micro-mobility products. That would include hoverboards, electric scooters, and e-bikes. And they do produce reports now on the deaths, injuries, and other kinds of hazards created by them. They're not as safe as the Segway. Although, Steve, the Segway wound up having two other kind of branding problems that would have probably hurt it even if it had been more sagaciously launched. One of them was sort of comedies. I mean, for me, it's Job Bluth in Arrested Development, and the Bluth family is just kind of a silly family that is, in fact, associated with injudicious business enterprises. And he's one of the more comical features in that family, and he's riding around on this scooter, of course, Paul Barth, mall cop, and then less comically, ultimately the guy who bought the company really tragically while he owned the Segway company, he died apparently while on a Segway trying to get out of the way of a dog walker and fell off a cliff. I mean, that's sort of the kind of thing that would really have dealt quite a blow to the brand if it had been thriving a little bit more.
Yeah, it sort of gives the lie to the old saw about all publicity is good publicity.
Right.
That one definitely wasn't. And the other one that I thought you were going to mention was President George Bush.
Oh, yeah.
Onto one and toppling straight over.
Also, a guy almost hit Usain Bolt, a photographer, I think.
Yeah.
So, people tend to focus on the bad things, but I don't know. Rereading some of this stuff today, Dan, I think the solution is, particularly since you insist on flagellating yourself about this one, I don't really think you made any big mistakes at all. But if you really feel bad about it, the thing you should do is get a leave of absence from Slate and put on your agent hat again. Sell the freaking movie rights to this thing right now. It is either a terrific movie or an HBO 6-parter or something waiting to happen. Like the plot has gotten better. I mean, I just mentioned a very tragic element of the plot, but that's actually, would work well in a film and that whole scene with Bezos, who, 20 years ago, nobody really knew who Jeff Bezos was, not the way we do now. That whole scene's an amazing scene. I know. I feel like now this is a really terrific, if slightly differently tinctured kind of project. So what about it, Dan? Can we get the movie made?
I'm just sorry we can't get Robert Duvall circa 1985 to play Steve.
Oh, we could cast Steve. We have to cast Cayman. That's going to be a complicated one.
He's a complicated character, As Steve notes, he's the world's greatest salesman. He's also mercurial and whimsical and anti-establishment and reportedly both inspirational and a gigantic pain in the neck to work for. The stories Steve and I, the things Steve witnessed while he was at DECA and the stories I heard from engineers I interviewed, even 20 years after the fact, all showed this incredible mix of total admiration and total exasperation to be working for this guy who brought the best out of you and then would undercut all your work by asking you to follow this total wild hare for the next year and send you hurtling away from your deadlines at rocket speed.
And Steve, he still remains kind of fascinating. I think last time I knew, he was trying to make artificial organs, which really could, once again, transform medicine. And I know he got all involved in selling PPEs to, I think, the VA or something during the pandemic. But there's sort of, I don't know, Steve, do you have the sense that we haven't heard the last of Dean Kamen and he might still invent something that really does transform the way we live?
Yeah, the word's tossed around too often, genius, but almost everybody who spends any time with Dean ends up using that word about him because it seems applicable. And he says he doesn't want to work on anything that's not going to change the world. Although I learned from Dan's piece that DECA invented something to do with soda pop.
It changed my world, Steve. The soda machine and movie theaters that lets you mix all different flavors in your Diet Coke. It's incredible.
I'm shocked that Dean worked on that. He must have gotten some real enticements. But he is working on something like the Stirling engine, which makes energy and clean water, because those were two of the biggest problems in the third world. And he wanted to fix that. I mean, he's the kind of guy who thinks, well, these major problems, I can fix that. I'm an engineer. And that's the inspiration that he gives to the people who work for him. So yeah, we're not through hearing about Dean.
All right. We're not through hearing about either one of our guests either. Steve Kemper has books he's written since then and books still to come. You can check all of that out on his website, which bears his name. Dan Kois is an editor and writer at Slate. Do listen to the whole Decoder Ring episode about this. It's really terrific and goes into more detail than we ever could have done right now. But Steve and Dan, great to talk to both of you again.
Thanks, Colin.
All right, we're going to take a break, and we're going to talk to somebody else who has a vision. Do squirrels have the secret to human and robotic motility? Somebody thinks so. Hi, we're back. Now is the time in the show when I issue my thank yous, and I will issue one, as I usually do, to Kat Pastor, who is our technical producer, kind of making everything happen the way it's supposed to happen. Jonathan McPants is the producer of this episode, and many others as well. We're going to conclude with a conversation that really does kind of link or blend kind of nicely to the preceding one. I should begin by declaring my own prejudices. I am part of a squirrel-friendly household. We have a squirrel known as the Little Professor who has been training us for quite some time I used to say him. It turns out to give her things that she wants to eat. And the reason I know it's a her is that the Little Professor has now produced a very annoying offspring who seems to be trying to take over the little professor's corner of the world. So anyway, squirrels are really fascinating. And if you're wondering, what are we going to do now that the Olympics are over and there's no gymnastics to watch anymore and you can't see Simone Biles and the other gymnasts doing these gravity-defying leaps, just look out your freaking window because the squirrels are out there doing things that no gymnast ever dreamed of. Here to tell us more about that is Lucia Jacobs, principal investigator at the Jacobs Lab of Cognitive Biology at the University of California, Berkeley, and co-author of a new study published in Science. Acrobatic squirrels learn to leap and land on tree branches without falling. Lucia Jacobs, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we even get to the subject of this particular study and the subject of the related article, you are a squirrel psychologist, which doesn't mean that squirrels come to you to talk about their intimacy issues or other problems that they're having. You're trying to understand squirrel cognition. And it's pretty clear, anybody who's ever watched squirrels or watched that 21-minute squirrel obstacle course video, there's a lot going on with these animals, right? They are thinking and problem solving a lot of their day, it would seem, correct?
Absolutely. And I wanted to say I've enjoyed your show very much. And in response to the first segment, when I was doing my PhD on squirrels at Princeton, I was asking the question, do squirrels remember where they bury their nuts? And I actually demonstrated that they did, which was actually the first demonstration that squirrels can remember where they bury their nuts. My best friends at the time were Ken Liebrecht and Earl Spiller, who were astrophysicists studying Earl, the weight of the universe, and Ken, the shape of the sun. And I was studying, do squirrels remember where they bury their nuts? So I'm used to squirrels being kind of the
comic relief
fringe show, right?
Yeah. Well,
yes, but they're fascinating animals. They're very long-lived. They're really what we call a spatial specialist, a champion species. They not only move in 3D the way, as we'll talk about, but they also cache nuts every year, 5,000, and remember where they cache them and have all these complicated decisions. And so they're really working this 2D space in incredible detail, and it's in fact we've shown that the squirrel brain actually it gets bigger in October when they're making all these 2D decisions.
Right. That's really there's so much to unpack in what you just said. But let's take a step back and talk about your friend who was trying to calculate the weight of the universe. Squirrels don't do that, but they do try to calculate or evaluate a nut based on its weight. Right. Explain that whole sort of head shaking thing.
So this was great. This was my graduate student, Stephanie Preston, who's now professor of human psychology at Michigan. And she came in one day and said, the squirrels are shaking their heads. Why are they shaking their heads when they have a nut in their mouth? And I said, Professor, oh, no, you didn't see that. And so we go out, we study the squirrels on campus. She shows me, lo and behold, something I've missed for decades. The squirrels, you give them a nut, they roll it in their paws, they put it between their teeth, and then they shake their head side to side. And Stephanie did a series of experiments to show that what they were actually doing, the only hypothesis we couldn't rule out was that they were actually weighing it the way if you picked up two light objects and you wanted to know which one was heavier, you would bob your hands and you would be able to control the acceleration, and you would be able to therefore feel the force on your skin and deduce the mass. And that's exactly what we think the squirrels are doing.
So, and not only do they remember where they buried their nuts, and you talked about the caches and the thousands of nuts, but they organize them. They're the Marie Kondos of the wild world. They actually organize them hierarchically.
Yes, we found that if you give them a random series of nuts, they will walnuts, pecans. We were just using commercial nuts: walnuts, pecans, almonds, hazelnuts, and peanuts, and they will move. They will cache. Even in a random series, they will cache the walnuts near each other, the almonds near each other, and they're not near each other. I mean, we're talking about, yards apart. And so the squirrel is caching, and this is over a period of an hour. They're caching over a very large area, and yet they're remembering the walnuts are northeast, the almonds are southeast. And so when they get a walnut, they carry to the northeast. They also have to remember where the other walnuts are, because we measure where the locations and the actual density of the nuts. So the distance from one walnut to the next is much larger than the distance from one peanut to the next, because the more valuable the nut, the more they disperse out, because other squirrels are trying to steal them. And if one squirrel finds a walnut, then they immediately start searching in that area for other walnuts. And so the more you space them out, the lower the risk of that nut being stolen.
Right. So, and that's something they think about a lot too. They think about other squirrels, observing them, caching their nuts. They exhibit self-control. We could be here all day. We could do a whole show with you. We probably should do a whole show with you. But yes, they're thinking about all these things. The next time you lose your smartphone, you should realize the squirrel would know where its smartphone is. It would be where it puts all that other kind of stuff, and it would all be grouped together.
Squirrels are too smart to need smartphones, I think, actually.
This looked into the specifics. This particular study looked into the specifics of something we've all seen squirrels do, which is sort of leap from one surface to another, usually from a branch to another branch, or a branch to a more stable object. You were trying to figure out what kinds of decisions squirrels make when they do this, and it turned out to be kind of an elaborate set of findings. There's some things that we could generally say. One of them is that squirrels, they're much more concerned with leaping from a stable surface if they possibly can. That's what more interest to them than how far they have to leap, correct?
Yes. I mean, we were not asking them. I mean, what we were challenging them with is it wasn't that large a gap we were asking them, but what they didn't know is how bendy or how compliant the takeoff was going to be. And so that's what, and what they've got so many mechanics to, once they leap, they change their body, they change their tail. They've got these incredible pads in their paws. They've got long claws, and they're extremely agile. So once they take off, they do things like, bounce off another surface, the parkour move we showed. But also when they hit the next branch, they would swing under, they can hold on, they can bring themselves up. It's very much like gymnastics. And in fact, the squirrels, no matter what we did, they were always able to get across and not fall.
So, actually, since you're bringing this up, I have to ask you, and I'm not saying that I watched that 21-minute Squirrel Ninja obstacle course video multiple times, but let's say I did.
Yes, yes.
So I think at one point, if I recall, one thing that he says there is that he thinks the squirrels are also kind of using their vision in an interesting way. Like as they're sort of tumbling through space, I don't know, they keep their eye focused on a certain point, or there's some way they have of kind of orienting themselves. That was this guy's non-scientific observation. I mean, do squirrels get the twisties, I guess, is what I'm really asking you.
I mean, that's exactly what I think our study is talking about, is what is the interaction between, cognition and physical ability. I mean, some people would say it's all cognition, but planning, executive planning, and motor skills, basically. That's absolutely what the twisties is all about. Mark Rober, who did those videos, he's fantastic and careful, and I've had long talks with him, and I love his videos. But our study is the first study to look at squirrels sleeping, so he's speculating about that. Squirrels are actually extremely visual. They're very unusual in that the whole group is diurnal, so they have very good vision. They've got good color vision. They've actually got visual cortex that's more similar to that of a monkey. It's if you put a rat and a monkey on a line, the squirrel is close, is monkey words in terms of how big its visual cortex is. So clearly they're extremely visual, but I mean, those questions are going to be great future research questions.
Right. So speaking of future research, first of all, I want to back up and just sort of clarify or help people out with one term you use. You use the term parkour. If you don't know that term, if you've seen movies like Casino Royale or The Bourne Ultimatum, seen these chase scenes where at least one of the participants seems able to kind of bounce off things in an urban landscape and sort of run almost parallel to the ground along a wall for just a brief interval. This is kind of a whole form of kind of martial arts and acrobatics and stunts that was developed and kind of sits under this name parkour. And what you discovered with this experiment was squirrels very quickly, if you change the distance that they have to fly through a little bit or the compliance, the springiness of the branch or something like that, they'll very quickly add that move, right, where they just let their feet bounce off a wall to get to their ultimate destination.
And yes, and that's exactly what they would do. And of course, there's no such thing as this problem that in these individual squirrels, these are all wild squirrels that are volunteers. They show up, they work for peanuts, and they don't have large climbing walls to practice on. So what we saw was, at the moment, innovation, definitely, of them starting to leap. The perch was more challenging, and so they bounce off, they hit the wall to slow their acceleration to make a more controlled landing.
So there's a long road that would have to be traveled from this kind of pure research to actual applications. But the applications are interesting, right? You could have a robot that goes into a situation like the collapsed Florida building that we followed a few weeks ago, going through tippy, unpredictable areas of rubble where rocks are canted up against one another and might be slipping and sliding to try to find somebody or rescue somebody. You could have a robot that maybe mimics that kind of decision-making and agility to get across a very problematic landscape.
Exactly. And I mean, I think what we're bringing is kind of giving a further goal to the field of robotics. It's like, this is what your robot should actually have to do. And we're part of a big 7 PI collaborative grant right now, funded by it's a multi-university research initiative to build a squirrel robot. And it's very blue sky, but what our group has done by brainstorming, there's been a lot of great information. And in fact, the roboticists are working on things like squirrel spines and squirrel claws, and they're pushing, and our behavior, the behavioral observations of real squirrels is actually pushing the roboticists into areas that it never occurred to them before, basically. We're also bringing cognition to the field of animal locomotion, which a lot of that is studying how animals move, but the way you do it is you poke them in the butt, not gently, but you give them a little startle and then they take off on a treadmill. And so what our study, where for one thing, you're using volunteer animals that come to you, they decide they want to participate, and then and they're also animals that are raised, they're wild animals, so that they've got all the experience, the motor experience of the species. It's not an animal that has had a restricted experience. And so I think I think we're just, it's just a tip of the iceberg on what squirrels can actually do and what we can actually study.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, having watched those videos, those squirrels are volunteers, but they know you guys. But they go, oh, here comes Judy again. I can tell she's in a bad mood today. They know you guys pretty well. We have to stop there. This is just fascinating stuff, though, and you've been a great guest. Lucia Jacobs, principal investigator at the Jacobs Lab of Cognitive Biology at the University of California, Berkeley, co-author of a new study published in Science. Look for the very exciting-looking cover. Acrobatic squirrels learn to leap and land on tree branches without falling. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thanks for listening. We always assume that you folks out there are as curious about things as we are, and we're very curious. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, you could recommend it to somebody who likes to listen to podcasts and likes to hear about squirrels and segways and unclassifiable astral bodies and other stuff as well. We'll see you later in the week.
Squirrels in my backyard. Squirrels in the public park. Squirrels climbing oak trees. Squirrels playing after dark. Squirrels. That's all I really want is squirrels. 10 at a time I want squirrels. With fuzzy bellies I want squirrels. I want to pet all the squirrels. Squirrels, 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 squirrels.